response I got last week for the video session, which you saw did not get made, was from our participant in Bogalusa, Louisiana. But her questions were more generic than they were time sensitive, so I thought, well, we'll just answer them here. What she asked was, she asked about the whole thing of the letter, how it was delivered and in what way would the congregation have received it. And the really good answer to that is, we don't know, but we presumed. You know, the assumption is that it was carried by somebody that Paul knew that was going, in other words, there was no mail system, he didn't drop it in a box somewhere. You know, that maybe it was some of the people mentioned were going back and took the letter. We also assumed that it was read to the congregation. Now, I don't know how long this letter takes to read through out loud, but I would think that would probably go through the first quarter of the Colts game, so we couldn't do that here. Some things you have to, you know, cultural. You know, was it read in its entirety? Was it read in part? We don't know. And part of the reason we assume it was read is that it's addressed to the congregation. It's not addressed to a leader or board. And the intention was that it be heard. And in that sense, its authority is not that, you know, I got a letter from Paul and I'm now telling you what Paul said. Rather, let's all hear Paul's letter and respond to it. So it's a valid question and one we don't think about, but as we said in the whole introduction to this study, it is remarkable that this congregation both preserved this letter and shared it with others. You know, it's kind of like saying, you know, our family has been through hell, and here are all the notes we sent, all the text messages we sent in anger back and forth to each other, and we're sending so that you can all read them, right? Oh, and by the way, we've gotten better, we're okay. You know, so I mean, because we know from 2 Corinthians, Paul doesn't revisit these questions. In other words, they had listened to the letter and they had done what he said, or these were no longer issues. It is interesting that the church found this valuable enough to them, and most of it is specific to their setting, that they shared it with other churches, who evidently also found it worthwhile enough to keep it. So when we got together for the Great Council in, what was it, 300 something, 67 AD, to decide what goes in and what doesn't, you know, there would have been X number of votes for 1 Corinthians because, oh yeah, we have that. That's Paul. So any other questions about that? Okay. Okay. Questions that arose from your readings? Or anything else that's stirred your interest in the last 14 days? By the way, while you're thinking about that, Sarah will be preaching on, her text will be from the 5 days of this coming week. But we will not have this session next week because we'll be focused on doodles, which is the subject of chapter 11, right?
Yeah.
When you gather together, you eat. Yeah, right, okay.
So the concept of, I don't really know as if I am totally correct, but Muslims and Quran really take the veil and everything to, is any of the stuff that Paul wrote in the Quran at the same time? About the
No, in the Quran, it's much later, centuries later,
centuries later.
like 600.
But did they copy any of this in it?
The whole thing about the structuring of society by genders was a Middle Eastern custom. And I think the whole custom of head covering for women was too. And so it's not like it's particularly Jewish, but it was Jewish. But it was, in other words, there evidently was the same concept in Corinth as there would have been in the Holy Land. You know, if a woman's got her hair down, we know what kind of woman she is. And so if she does, then either put your hair up or put a hat on, you know, wear a veil. In Islam, this structure of society is much more extreme, and women are at a much, yeah, that's their role. And I appreciate the question, Dave, because when we read the Bible, we see this as coming from what we call the Holy Land. We forget that the Holy Land itself is a crossroads for all the great cultures of the ancient world, because all the great cultures of the ancient world centered in two watersheds, the Nile or the Tigris-Euphrates. And the Holy Land is a bridge between those. And so all the mixtures of customs and practices come through. And then as empires spread, like the Greek Empire and then the Roman Empire, you know, it's simply the scope of culture gets imprinted on a much wider scale than before. Everything grew out of a culture and a context. And the culture and the context framed the situation and probably also instigated the response. If it had not been a custom, you know, if it was, Paul didn't have to tell them, you know better. You know, I mean, he wasn't saying, I forgot to tell women there are prescriptions about what you do and don't do. He's calling them back to that. Remember, see? So he's calling them back to their own context. I found it interesting in looking at this text 11 and being guilty of what I always blame you all for doing. You know, I have spent so much time doing these stories that sometimes you don't read them carefully again. And unfortunately, the commentary I was using writing this book did. And so I went back and, yes, he never questions, has no hesitation about the women getting up and praying and prophesying. That's not the issue at all. And anybody who goes there is not reading the text. His concern was, what is their appearance doing to the message? Right? Did any of you ever take part in Youth Sunday? And see, Youth Sunday was a mixture of feelings by the adults in the church. It was when they were so glad to see their children up front being so cute and that's my son. And, oh my God, it's Youth Sunday. Because one of the things youth have to do is we must flaunt authority, right? Because church is fuddy-duddy. So we are going to do, we're going to do the Apostles' Creed as a rap, right? I mean, that's in our culture that, you know, yeah. And, you know, I think that's what Paul's facing. You know, yeah, what you're doing is good, that's great, but, you know, they probably stopped listening to you when they're staring at your hair. You know, we go somewhere that Paul wouldn't go. We make Paul into a woman hater that he really was not. Okay, so that was done to fill in time so that you could bring your questions up and think about them and bring them forward.
I like chapter 12,
Why?
spiritual gifts. So often in the church or anywhere, you ask somebody about something and they're like, oh, I can't do that. I couldn't do that. You know? How do you know? Some of us play the piano. We didn't know we could do that. I'm just telling you, I've never done that before. I've never played in church before I did here.
Really?
Yeah, yeah.
You do a very
And so, I mean, it's kind of like read that thing about if you've got a gift, is there a place to use it? Maybe not the best gift, you know, but you're doing what you can. And so there are many things that we say we're hesitant to do without understanding if it's God's gift. If it's a gift given to us to use in God's service, then God will be there to say, it's okay. You'll get the next vote. So, I mean, I think when we work with Logos, we always talk about being called, that people have, if you look for people's gifts, and sometimes you don't recognize your own gift, and somebody else will, and say, why don't you do, and then we help another person recognize their own gifts to share. And one of our little cliches was, when God calls, God equips. You know, if you say yes to God, then you're not doing it alone. And so the whole thing about that there are lots of different gifts that we have. And if you've ever done one of those spiritual gift surveys, inventories, that you can do a whole thing to figure out what are your spiritual gifts and how many of them are there. Oh my gosh, there's a ton of them. You know, what is your gift? And so I think, and then it was interesting about the hierarchy. You know, is your gift better than my gift? Or your gift more important, or your gift higher? So I really like chapter 12.
Let's talk about spiritual gifts, two things. First of all, Paul makes a list here, you know, right? It's in 12, 4 through 11.
Right.
It is the tendency of us to then say, now we have the complete list. Okay, so let's list those. Those are the gifts that that the Spirit gives to the church. Therefore, those are the only gifts we need. And if you have those gifts, then we're done. There are 3 such lists Paul makes. And there are a lot of similarities, but there are differences. He even gets down and includes the word administration, you know, is a gift of the Holy Spirit, which I thought, you know, the administrative work of church boards generally is the most unspiritual thing we do. But that's evidently only because that's the way we do it. It's supposed to be one of the holy things we do. So I think Paul would say, well, there are many gifts. Here are just some that I put down. And so that's why in 3 different occasions, the lists have some variation. Or he saw the need in that church to mention this particular gift, you know, because, okay. The other is the whole idea. Paul, remember, in the very beginning of this letter, talks about them being called by the Holy Spirit. The church in Corinth exists because of the will of the Holy Spirit. If therefore this church exists because it is God's intention, then what Paul is saying, God will equip the church with the gifts the church needs. I was so helped by someday we're going to have a meeting about Logos so you can all understand what the heck we're talking about, because its theology is wonderful. The idea was that if you cannot find the person who has the gift that they're willing to give, don't find somebody to do it who doesn't have the gift. Have you ever been in a situation where you got somebody to say yes because we had to fill the nominating list and they would do it, put my name down? Did that ever turn out to be a great choice? You know, I mean, what you want is the person, yes, and see, the other part of this is it's a challenge to not look at it as a task you're being asked to do, but as a gift you're being asked to share. That's a whole different way we think. I don't have time for, but you have the calling for. So maybe part of that calling is what else you're doing. that keeps you from this. And it makes then, when you accept positions, if you feel called to that, then you're following God's lead, not the needs of the structure. The other thing I learned from that is, if you can't find the person with the gift, don't do it. Churches are trying to see how to cope with changing society. We think we're the church facing that, and nobody else ever has. The church has always faced that. And so we have great ideas about how it should, and they probably are great ideas. And they've probably worked in other places phenomenally. But if you don't have the people with the gift to do it, you're all going to be frustrated and it'll fail. And that will redouble your gloom. You know, we tried and it didn't work. And so we've done it that way before and it won't ever work, And instead, what you may need to do is to look at the gifts God has given to this church and say, let's go that way because that's where our giftedness is. In other words, instead of trying to be like this church that's doing X, Y, and Z, we can't be that church. But what kind of church can we be? And when we look in as to what we have, and then the other thing you have to do is you have to get people to think about it that way, that you are gifted. Now, we need to help people look at what are their gifts and how can they give them for the sake of the kingdom.
I appreciate Betsy's gift of prayers for this study, and day 15 hit close to home, I thought, for me. So, anyway.
See, now we're all going to read it and try to analyze it. Yeah, okay.
Oh, yeah.
She forgot mileage.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, okay.
That's why it only felt a little bit like you.
Yeah.
I think it'd be interesting to take a gift survey.
Yeah.
I didn't know.
And they're
they existed.
online. I mean, you can do it online. I mean, you can do it as this thing, or you can do it as a group, And it's really interesting to look at that. And I really think the music thing, it was a Saturday night,
Yes.
when you got
okay.
the call on
Yeah,
Saturday night,
yeah.
and Debbie couldn't be there. It was like, I think I can do that. I could, as long as we had Haley.
Yeah,
I thought, no, we had Haley, so I could give a chord, and then y'all could sing.
Yeah.
That would work.
Right.
And so, but it was the willingness to say, I got a little bit of that. And I've enjoyed just doing it, I mean, playing at home. But yeah, sometimes we don't know that we have.
Yep.
Or you have to be willing. I don't know.
first time that keyboard's been used in a long time.
That's right.
I'm just amazed that you've never played in worship before. Yeah.
So how have you been using your gifts for the last 50 years?
What?
All your gifts you have?
Oh, the piano, I mean, the music, took piano as a kid. Then I went to guitar.
Oh, really?
Playing guitar.
She's gonna be a rock star.
I was gonna be a rock star.
Oh.
My son said he plays sounds like John Denver.
Yeah.
It's good. I mean, that was, and there again, that was me. That wasn't. Because it's like you were saying about speaking in public. So yeah, at home, you're fine. Sounds really good. And then it's like, I don't know what note that is.
Now, did you notice that Paul has an agenda here? The problem in the church in Corinth is not that they don't understand spiritual gifts. It is they have one of those gifts that has gotten way
Oh, yeah.
out of hand. Describe that problem, the gift of speaking in tongues. How had that become a problem in the Corinthian church?
Like, no one could interpret what you're saying.
Okay, that's one issue, but that's not the
The
big
way
one.
they were kind of bragging, I can speak in tongues. And your gift isn't as good as
I'm
mine,
closer
you
to
can't.
God than you are, because God uses me to speak to others. I hope you can have it sometime. See? Yeah, right? If you've ever had a real spiritual experience, you're so excited about it and you want to share it. And it comes off as like, what's wrong with you? And when did they let you out of the home? You know, I mean, it's off-putting because they have not had the same experience, and so you don't know what to do with it. And that's the problem. The way Paul addresses that, it says, okay, first question that should be asked in worship, can anyone understand what's being said? And if not, what use is it? A baby crying may remind us of new life, but what else is it doing for the sake of worship? You know, yes, these people are speaking in a tongue supposedly understood only by God. So, you know, how does that help the church? We could put a sign out front, you know, the changing letterboard, number of people who spoke in tongues this Sunday. You know, our goal is 100. So, you know, what Paul does is he does exactly what he has done. He has put some order to this. Okay, that's fine. But first of all, ask, can someone interpret? If not, no thank you. See? So, yeah. And I think it is interesting between the discussion of spiritual gifts and the at length issue about dealing with speaking in tongues. You have chapter 13. Because when you are just feeling so good about how you spoke in tongues, how are you showing the love of Christ? See? And I think,
Because you're focused on yourself and
yeah,
not
yeah.
what the real.
And it seems to me, I didn't count it, but I think he spends more time on speaking in tongues, not in a positive way, than he does on any other issue. To kind of go back to 11. What did you learn? Describe to me how would you describe what the Corinthians did when they came together for worship?
A potluck.
They had a
That's what it
potluck.
sounds like to me.
Well, potluck means you put the food out and everybody shares.
No,
Okay.
well, it was a gathering. It was a fellowship dinner. It was, I mean, everybody came together and they brought their stuff. But it wasn't a potluck.
Yeah.
It was,
Everybody came with their own picnic basket. The Lord's Supper was put within the context of a meal because the Lord's Supper originated in the context of a meal. Also, and here again, this is, you know, the presumptive part. We know that a lot of the early converts were not from the upper class, although there is instances in Paul's writings where there were some of those people. This was not just the poor folk church. But that meant that they had very limited time, some servants and some slaves. So when their time together could be, they may have gathered at the end of the work day, so you're hungry, and while we're there, so. And so everybody is coming with their own food, and some people, you know, stopped and picked up a to-go meal at FOA Schwartz or somewhere, and the rest of you just came with what you found in the glove box. And everybody, when you got there, you just went ahead and ate. So there's no community, there's no relating, it's just feed yourself. And of course, some were gorging themselves and others were going hungry. Paul says there's something wrong here. You know, I mean, he's very observant that way. So that what he's calling them is, you know, the spirit of the meal is not consistent with the reason we're having the meal, which is to remember the Lord's Supper. And see, we've so enshrined the Lord's Supper as a part of worship that the whole thing of, you know, what if next Sunday, instead of the Lord's Supper being served in worship, it was held out here after we'd all been, had chicken and noodles? Okay. It's a whole different setting that's hard for us to see.
Okay, so in Acts, it talks about people gathered to hear what happened from worship on Sunday. That they met every week and they had the Lord's Supper every week. So what was the worship service in Corinthians? I mean, had they just gathered for the meal first? Did they have, was there teaching, was there prayers, did they do anything else, or did? So it sounds like the only thing they did
didn't tell us.
on worship was to was to eat, and then maybe, I guess, partake of the bread and the cup, I don't know. So we don't have any sense of what their worship.
We know
Order of
that
worship
the nature of worship was very much like one a Jew would have experienced in a synagogue, which would be prayers and scripture and exposition on the scripture. And then it would be like, then they added the Lord's Supper at the end of that. And the practice in the church off and on through the ages had been almost to keep those as two separate things, because this was for everybody and this is only for baptized believers. For example, the Christian Church Disciples of Christ started, one of the things that helped them grow was they stressed formally trained preachers, not just, you know, somebody who got inspired of an idea. And so the preaching tended to be so good that people would come for the sermon. And then when it was time for communion, most of the people would leave. But most of the people weren't baptized anyway, so they should leave. That's a good question. That kind of makes you question how those two fit together. You know, was it normal for the worship? Did they gather and eat and then have the worship?
I like the comment, the proof of faith there on day 16 was the believer picks up a rattlesnake. You know, it's kind of reminded me of when
Yeah.
God told Moses to cut that snake and turned it into a staff.
Go down in the hills of Appalachian, you can go to church like that. They'll have them in a big container.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah. If you've got the faith, honey, put your hand in.
You know, I heard a minister talk on that one Sunday when I was coming to church, and he did it kind of like Moses said to God, "No, you pick it up."
You made it.
Yeah, you made it. You pick it up.
I didn't leave it here.
Yeah, right.
Not a bad comeback. No, there is a tradition in the hill country of snake handling as an act of worship, sign of faith.
And is that based on the thing between God and Moses, or what do they base that on?
It's in the book. So if it's in the book, we got to do it. It is curious that how
Interpretation.
how somebody latches onto something and makes religion out of it. You know.
Should not test your God.
Yeah, it's not the Lord thy God to the test.
I'm just
So
curious how many
they like-
people actually do it and don't do it.
So then do they make a meal out of the rattlesnake afterwards? I mean,
Or do they make
fellowship?
a meal out of the person that died? I don't know. Seemed logical to me. Yeah, I don't know that the object is to kill the snake, it's whether or not the venom, it's kind of like the witch trials, Dunk her in the water, and if what is it? If she floats, she's a witch, or if she sinks, she's a witch.
Either way.
And it helps if you know which is which. You know, kind of like, you know, here's this arbitrary test that has no meaning, so put your hand in.
Well,
Yeah.
kind of like I'm melting.
But I think, you know, to extrapolate from what Paul says about speaking in tongues, the same should be true of anything else, you know. Well, if you can't quote scripture, you're not a real Christian. You know, if you can't play the piano, then you're not a real Christian. You know, if you can't, you know. Folks, then what we're doing is we, humans, are deciding what is really decided by God. And when we get that point, then we have removed our need for God. And we're in trouble. You know? I've often wondered if these lines at the end of the worship institution about, you know, if you do this in an inappropriate way, you'll get sick and die. Were there examples of that? You know? People were getting sick and die. How long had they had that bread and wine? Where was it stored? If that led to the way in which structures of the church were created and rigid rules about the Lord's Supper were always done to try to protect it so we wouldn't mess it up. But then the office of doing it became more important than what was happening. It would be good if you're going to come, that you come with a clear conscience, so go to confession. Became you cannot have the Lord's Supper unless you have been to confession. And by the way, who is going to give you the loaf and the cup is the one you wouldn't confess to, so I know. Now, and it's all about power. I got the bread and you don't, and you ain't getting it.
And that's, I mean, so true today, because you heard about, you know, the Catholic Church and Biden.
Yep.
Or whatever the, you know, the political leaders are who are Catholic, they take a stand on abortion or something that the Catholic Church doesn't agree, and then they'll say, well, he can't take communion. Because he disagrees with the tenets of the church.
Yep.
And so that's there.
Yeah, it curious for us Midwesterners. Our attitude about authority in general is not too positive. And when authority comes down to us, to the church, we don't like it unless we, of course, agree with it in advance. But that's been a part of all religion. Power is involved. But it's also why there are so many different kinds of Christianity. They all are born out of some crisis of power.
The comment on day 16 also about the church hopping.
Mhm.
It's an epidemic. I mean, I think that's why we have so many churches today, and, you know, people, and maybe that's why there's people out there is unsure what the belief is. Do you think? I mean,
Well, yeah. Well, we have made Christianity a personal experience. And having made it that, and you have a culture of indulgence, you know, what is every manufacturer of cosmetics saying? You deserve it. You need to satisfy yourself. Okay, well, we do that in Christianity as well, you know. Well, I had this very comment yesterday. We're not happy here. Not at this church. And so what are you going to do? Well, right now they're not going to church. So why don't you go to a church where you're happy? Because it probably wouldn't take too long till you're not happy there either. I mean, you see what we do with that? So what's the opposite of that? Just stick around in a situation you find semi-intolerable and turns you off, and so you're kind of a nominal member, you're on the rolls, but don't show,
So that's where you gotta get in tune with your inner person
Yeah,
and
yeah.
talk to God about it,
Yeah.
right?
I thought seldom if ever do we hear of someone changing churches in order to better serve God or answer to God's call.
Yeah.
And I wrote down Tom Archer.
Yeah.
We had a person at
Yeah.
work who came, they were very mission-minded, and somehow their church decided not to do the missions that they believed in. And so they left that church. So you're not happy. And they came to our church. And it was a God thing because they brought us the concept of mission. You know, I mean, that was their passion, that was their call, and they showed the church how important that was. We took Mexico mission trips, the youth
Yeah,
mission
yep.
trips, and so it was, they left the church because they didn't agree with it, but they brought that passion they had to another church. So that, I mean, that, if you're not happy with the church, but it's like what it is that you really don't like, you know, what is important to you? Where are you gonna find that somewhere else?
Another example from the same congregation, my best friend at the time, I was commenting on how much I appreciated the fact that he was always in church. And he paused for a moment to think about that. He said, well, it's not because of you.
Wow.
He said, I learned long ago that sometimes I go to church and I don't feel a thing. But I know someone there does. And I want to stay close to that. Yeah. He also had a good vision about people who leave church. Because we had a lot that did. When you're adding 100 members a year and you've only grown your average worship by 20%, you kind of wonder what's really going on here. And he cogitated on whoever had last left and what their reason was. He said, I don't think they're being honest with themselves. I think they were looking for a reason to leave. And now I've got one. That preacher was snarky with me. So I'm gonna leave the church. So I was looking for a reason to leave, and now that I've got one, everybody go, well, yeah, I understand, he is that way. And I wonder if we have, everything in our culture is about how you feel and what you want and what you're, getting what you want, satiating your desires. And when we make our religion that, then we're almost by our nature shopping. And today you can comparative shop. You don't even have to go to another church. You can watch it online. Ooh, that's much better,
I think too, because I think a lot of those people are spectators. It's not feeding me, it's not feeding me. What are you doing?
Yeah.
I think about, we had a person in this church who had little kids, and she said, you know what? They just ought to be a children's choir. There ought to be a children's choir. I could lead a children's choir, she thought. And she did. And then the preacher who said, once upon a time, turned your complaints into job description.
Yep.
So if there's something wrong in the church, then what are you gonna do about it? Rather than, I'm gonna throw rocks.
Yeah. So what else? This is the very last time in eternity that you can ask a question about 1 Corinthians, so you better get it all out of you. This topic will never come up again.
It was one of those chapters for last week that I thought, too bad they can't teach religion in school, because this would have been a good chapter to teach junior high on up. And I think it was the one about marriage and, how what's supposed to go on there and stuff.
So what part of that did you think was?
Well, I mean, it's just, about how, you know, how you're supposed to treat each other as individuals and what marriage really means and what God intended for it to mean.
It's how it makes me feel. That's what it's all about.
Yeah. So,
Meism.
because nowadays it seems like, okay, we have a baby and then we get married, maybe.
Right.
I mean,
In that order.
I don't mean to. It seems like that's the way.
Well, I need your feedback. It is apparent to me that there is, for a number of you, this kind of a study works for you and works well. I want you to think about why that is. What part of the way we do this makes you do it and that feeds you the most, as we try to figure out what else we can do. The deliberate structure is a weekday reading and reflection. That also, what you hear on Sunday is going to have something taken from what you've read. So, and then this book is different than the others we've used, right? The other, you got some background and then some questions to reflect on, and this is all commentary. So also, what I want you to do is reflect on the material you're given, which one best works for you. So, but what are your comments about your experience? Because we've done, what,
Well,
4 or 5?
for me, I've liked both. The first one, you know, where we've had to answer questions and stuff, that, you know, it makes you think, and so you write it down, whereas you pretty much put it here on paper in
Yeah.
this form.
Yeah, we tended to answer the questions more than just raise them.
Yeah.
But then if you were doing this study with those original ones where there were a series of questions and you didn't come to this session,
You can go get the commentary.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
That's a good point.
and for me, I liked this, I liked them all, but I like this getting the commentary because then it makes me think it in different context or how I would apply it to me differently. So maybe I would have answered the questions a little differently. Makes me dig a little deeper, think a little deeper, think.
So you found the questions promoted more thinking than,
I think the
Oh,
other way
they-
around. I think
okay.
having the commentary first
okay,
Makes
okay,
me
then when you got them.
think about it differently or
Yeah.
dig deeper, and then if we have questions. Otherwise, the questions, you just might kind of at surface, just rattle something off or write something down, but without really, I didn't
Going
really think
deep
about
thought.
it that way.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a whole different
Yeah,
thing about covering your head or whatever, you know? Like, okay, now how do I apply that in my life? Or
grabbing that rattlesnake.
Yeah.
you know, I never realized until I was working on this sermon where loose woman came from.
The hair, that would be loose, yeah.
There you go.
It's biblical. So you can use that freely now. 'Cause it's in the- Okay, well, thanks for that feedback. What else? What do others of you feel?
Yeah, Leslie and I's given our opinion, everybody else needs to talk.
Yeah,
It's all about us, Rhonda.
yeah, because we're better students.
Why did the rest of them come, right?
They're gonna get stars and
That's right.
stickers.
It's all what we need.
Some of our spiritual gifts are just to listen.
There you go.
Some of you like to talk.
For some, a spiritual gift would be to talk less.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
See her?
But I
Well,
like how
I
you,
guess Leslie and I don't have to come the next time.
That's in
No, we
chapter
like your
19.
input.
I like how you answered Abe's question earlier about the two rivers, and that's a crossing points of a lot of different religions and that culture and how it manifests in maybe different religions. And so that historical aspect you just added, like, oh, really? That's cool for me to learn that today.
And in a way, they're a bit more like us than our ancestors were. We're in touch with the entire world all the time. We may not realize what we're seeing, but there's no such thing as remote anymore.
Yeah.
Somebody hiccups in Beijing and we have 15 minutes of it on TV. We're still confused by how interrelated humanity is. But we realize we are. I can't fly this plane because the chip that runs the nav system is in a box somewhere in a port in China. So all I am is frustrated, but I know why. I think the thing where modern Christianity fails the most is helping us to appreciate and understand, or understand and appreciate, how much of what we hold and believe we have received. It is not a choice we made, it was already in and a part of us, and we've only become aware of it. I don't like liturgical services. I'm uncomfortable in them. They don't do anything for me. That is because all my life I have been in what is called a free church, non-liturgical. Uncle Bob, who is coming, is of the Presbyterian tradition, and Presbyterians love words. And there are printed calls to worship and on and on and on. Because of my experience, of my culturalization, those are just words to me. For another person, they bring them closer to God. It's kind of the same way you react to music. Some music touches you because of where you've been and others totally turn you off, and you can't even understand why people even try to listen to it. Our religion, as we experience it, is constantly in that mix. And if we don't understand that, then we're trying to say that's all either of God or not of God, when really it just happens to be the culture we live in. But we need to sort through that, or we don't know what really is important to us.
I think something that stood out to me in reading about this is a lot of Paul's comments weren't so much on what a worship service should look like as what the church should be doing. If you have a gift, you should be doing this, and how's it going to help the church? Or you guys shouldn't be doing this because it's distracting. Or I would say more action versus. Well, and he had a lot of corrections to give him. It was more about.
I think relational. He talks about the church in our relationship with one another.
Mhm.
Like you said, the same thing, whether we're doing or not doing. How does that affect the relationship that I have with you?
Well, and since you mentioned that, part of what Paul has been saying from the beginning, and this deal about head coverings is a good example of that. If people get hung up, when people get hung up on the way you do it, or the way you act, or what you say, or what you do or don't do, then they don't get to the gospel. And if that gets in the way, give that up for the sake of their being able to perceive the gospel. What we've experienced with the unchurched is church people are generalized. So that the last person they saw on TV spewing venom about, to protect the babies, let's kill all the abortion doctors. When you see that being said by a TV preacher and you don't go to church, then that's the way all Christians are. Or I went to church once when I was a teenager and I looked like a freak and they treated me like that. So all Christians are like that. Yeah. When you go to a church and all the concern is raising enough money to keep the doors open, then what is the church? What have you got for me? I know what you want from me, but what have you got for me?
I often wonder too about like what to wear to church, Back when it was like everybody had to dress up. You talked about the suits and the ties and all that kind of thing. On the other hand, I'm like, yes, I want to honor God. I want to, be clean and be presentable and that kind of thing. But on the other hand, for newcomers that come to church or whatever, they may not have a working wardrobe of dress clothes. And what am I saying to them when I don't wear jeans and a, clean shirt or something versus always dressing up? It's like, oh, I can't be a part of you guys. You aren't like me. So I think maybe I shouldn't dress up too much when I come to church because they can't relate to that.
I'm talking with the youth one time about, dressing up. They don't even, their jeans and their cut-off shorts and they're dressed up.
Yeah.
And
Right.
we were talking to the kids, they were taking up the offering or serving communion or something one time.
Offering.
And so, the girls' short shorts are really short, and stuff. So I said, and we had older people in the church, the guy who always wore the suit and tie. And the people were so kind, they would never say anything to the youth, but you knew. So to talk with the kids about, we're all glad you're here, but if what you're doing, taking from Christian,
If how much of you we can see.
right, if you're distracted from somebody else's worship, does that, do you have some kind of responsibility for caring about other people? So we had a really good conversation. I'm like, okay. So the next Sunday morning, when the guys was getting ready, at the very end, he said, "Mom, where's my dress shirt?" She said, "What? What do you do?" Well, Betsy said we should, he really wanted to wear a button shirt so that, but then you save time, you have a discussion with adults, about, okay. Yes, that may not be like you would like to dress, but the kid's here. Or that person's here, they're here.
Right.
So sometimes we need to have those discussions among ourselves about when do we judge?
Pastor Keith's revelation about how to change the church. Always have the kids make the change. This particular thing, when I went to that church, the offering preceded communion. And my problem with that was the implication can be, if you give, you can eat. Right? So why can't we move the offering to some other place? Well, you see, the deacons have to get up and leave their seat, so they'd have to do that twice. Exactly like it is here. And I already knew that. And so instead of even involving the deacons, we simply said, the youth will take up the offering in the earlier time slot. And they so possessed that they didn't have a schedule. Leslie and, would be on the first Sunday and Linda be on. No, it's just they needed 7. And whoever the oldest one was there was go, okay, there's 5 of us. He's up sitting with his mother. He's not getting away with that. I'm going to go get him. And they took care of it and did it every Sunday for years. And because of that, That's why I don't think their attire became an issue, because they were doing it. And I guess enough of the people were glad, our youth don't just attend worship, they accept their
Every Sunday was
responsibility.
Youth Sunday.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, if we have a song we want them to learn, let's have the kids sing it, and then we'll all, sneak it in. Kids, nobody will notice. The other thing you could do is to suggest books you'd really like to study. Most people will eventually come up with Revelation because they haven't ever figured it out. But my experience is most people, once they do it, really don't enjoy it. If that makes sense. It's kind of like wandering through some of the books of the Old Testament. You don't know why you took this exit and wish you could find the freeway again. And to this point, I have pretty much been able to draw on stuff I've done before. So if we're going to go on to something else, then I have to figure out when I'm gonna have the time for that. I start auditions for my Christmas play next Wednesday. So you might see me. I don't know.
And when is that? In December, right?
First 2 weekends in December.
First 2 weekends.
See, this couple went off to Hollywood and we thought they were gonna get married, and they never did. And now they've come back home at Christmas, and they want just a simple, small town Christmas wedding. And that just sounds sweet. Unfortunately, to get out of their contractual obligations in Hollywood, they had to agree that their wedding would be filmed for a reality TV show. Where do you think this is going?
Yeah.
Okay, so now you know the play. Okay.
What's the name of it?
Christmas Wedding. I mean, it's,
Vanity Theater.
of course, where only the vain can come. Thank you all, and you come up with questions for next week, I'll sit her on the way out and say, so what's your meeting?
What day are we supposed to be on? Are we supposed to be doing these 5 days a week or 7 days a week?
No, you're supposed to be doing 5 days a week.
Okay, so I'm
And
probably
see
on.
the-
There we
There you
are.
are.
Okay, I got an official.
You're ready for
Day 18.
Good, thank you.
September
Say that
1
again.
and 2
Thank
were
you. Okay.
Thursday and Friday.
Tomorrow's day 18.
So and we go through 22,
Okay,
I
Okay.
think
so tomorrow's 18.
That's what I've got.
18, 19, 20, 21, 22, yes.
Yeah, I had to go through and put down
The date.
day
Yeah.
and date.
Okay. I'm gonna do that right
And
now.
if we ever do this again, I'm gonna put in page numbers.
Well, that would have been nice.
I do.
And make sure that they're in order.
Yeah.
Wow. Did you take yours apart?
It is interesting how many
That's
people
why I got
never
these
mention
clipped.
that.
Oh, I didn't take mine apart.
Like when I started.
That's funny.
We were.
Yeah.